Great to be here. So Mark got to choose two of these regions. I get to choose one, and I chose Atlanta. Great to be here in the South. We're fighting back across the South, right? No one's giving up. We're standing up. We're fighting back. We're on our feet. We're ready to fight, right? Okay. So on your chairs is something that looks like this. And CWAers recognize it because the last month or so, we've been focused on this. And I hold it up because if you could pull it out, that'd be great. This is going to be more about that than a speech, because I'm really here to say that the only way out of the crisis we're in is to dig much deeper than we're used to. This crisis is an economic crisis. It's certainly a crisis about workers' rights. It's an environmental crisis that gets worse every day. But fundamentally, it's a democracy crisis. Now, several of the CWAers that are here have been camping out recently with Occupy Atlanta. Who's been doing that? Any of you been doing that? Stand up. Walter, I know you've been sleeping outside. Stand up. Yeah, there we go. And one of the bright spots of 2011, and I realize everybody in the room, we have some corporate support here too, and we appreciate that. But for those of us coming from labor in the heart of the green community, 2011 was a year of resistance. It's not business as usual. My brother Walter is not used to, at least recently, sleeping outside, fighting the battle to keep jobs at AT&T, which is what he's been doing the last 10 days. It's not business as usual. It wasn't business as usual when students, graduate students, public workers, private sector workers, 100,000 or more strong marched on Madison, Wisconsin a year ago, right? That was not business as usual. It wasn't business as usual when in Ohio a surge of political activity occurred, and by a landslide we repealed Senate Bill 5 to preserve public sector bargaining rights. That wasn't business as usual, right? It wasn't business as usual when 45,000 Verizon workers walked off the job in August, not so much to get a new contract as to send a signal across the country that these kinds of cuts by corporations like Verizon, $100 billion company, not bankrupt, but in fact profits growing and soaring and CEO pay growing and soaring, and yet they come to the workers at Verizon and say, we need to cut your health care. We need to cut your pension. We need to cut your jobs, exporting jobs to Asia, even as we stand here now. Call center jobs, tech support jobs, not just the manufacturing jobs that so many steelworker and other sisters and brothers here are familiar with, jobs being shipped out of America, as Mark talked about, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. So we know what the crisis is. We know that in 2011, resistance hit a new level in the streets, in the parks, in the communities, in the state houses, from the Midwest to the South, as elected officials, if we call them that, attempted to gut our rights, public and private sector alike. And at the same time, most of corporate America cutting our jobs, shipping our jobs out of the country, and cutting our rights as well. So in CWA, we said, what can we do that's different? And Blue-Green Alliance is very much central to this. And so this chart is titled The 99%. And in the latest issue of the CWA News, you see a flag, and this whole issue is about what we call broken democracy. The democracy is broken as the 1% takes over virtually everything. And as critical as the election is this year, you won't hear us say in our union, this is the most important election ever. We might have said that in 2008. We ain't going to say it. Because as important as the election is, what's more important is how do we build a new movement for democracy and economic justice and environmental justice in America? How do we build that movement? What does that look like? And so on this picture or slide, you see the top part of the slide is what we've been working for. In the center there is what we've been working for in CWA and other unions too, but this was a CWA slide. Secure jobs, fair trade, health care for all, retirement security, bargaining and organizing rights. When we came in as a founding member of Blue-Green Alliance, joining the Steelworkers, Sierra Club, NRDC, and then others have joined since. We welcome every partner. For us, we knew even then, years ago, that we would not achieve bargaining and organizing rights in this country if just labor worked on it. And those environmental partners from the beginning said, yes, you stand up for climate change in a deep way, not just an easy way, by the way. We're talking about in a deep way. Working people, you fight with us for climate change, and we get it, that we have to fight for workers' rights, because there'll be nobody to fight for climate change if there are no workers' rights. And that was a founding notion. And so you see on partner issues, number one, climate change, and number two, DREAM Act, and number three, fighting against the foreclosures, which here in Georgia has been devastating and across the country. And over on the left side there, you see President Obama, much more modest goals. Fairer taxes, infrastructure projects, public service. His agenda. It's all blocked by this wall. You don't see it as well here because it's not in color, but it's fine. You get the idea. The wall is the limits of our democracy. Campaign finance, billionaires now dominating really both political parties. You're going to have a $2 billion election in 2012. Is that a shock that our core agenda is going to be missing when that kind of money is involved the way it is? The Koch brothers have an annual meeting of billionaires, literally. 8 or 10 of them sit there and they say, okay, we're each going to give at least $10 million this year to make sure our agenda dominates this country. And they are doing that. Last year, this year, they have a plan. Our democracy is blocked then by the dollars in politics, and the Occupy movement across the country has been as much about that as anything else. The billionaires and the grip they have. The Senate rules. We would have had the Employee Free Choice Act. We had a majority in the Senate. 60% of the House voted for it. That would have given workers in the private sector a path to at least have a seat at the table, have bargaining rights, have union recognition. Blocked in the Senate by rules that are worse than the rules in the 1960s that prevented, for a time, the civil rights agenda of Lyndon Johnson. But in the 1960s, those racist senators had to they had to stand up and speak all night and spout their racism. And eventually they were worn down, and those civil rights bills were passed. Today in the U.S. Senate, one senator can block a nomination. One senator blocked climate change legislation that had passed the House from coming to the floor. One senator could block the Employee Free Choice Act. 400 bills adopted by the House in the last Congress, not this one, never were spoken about for 1 second on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The filibuster took on a new meaning where they never had to talk. All they had to do was raise their hand. And then it took 60 senators to get the bill to the floor, and then 60 senators again to cut off amendments, and then 60 senators again to get a final vote. And so almost nothing was ever debated, let alone passed. And voter suppression, states like Georgia, Florida, Texas, 38 states, Ohio, not just here in the South, have passed or are about to pass the worst voter suppression legislation in this country since Jim Crow. They have a plan, the Koch brothers, to shrink the democracy, to make sure that there's no legalization path for immigrants. And in neighboring state here of Alabama, you have the worst anti-immigrant legislation ever passed in this country. And these four things together are the limits, the blocks on our democracy, so that the things that we were founded for here in BGA, climate change, workers' rights, economic justice, there's no path to it. It's blocked. And what you see here is an arrow, 7 to 10 years. And next to that arrow, you see coalition of labor plus partners, 50 million plus. That is the kind of movement we are building and need to build. much deeper, frankly, than what any of us signed up for. You know, I spent my life in this union, so did my sisters and brothers that are here, not just from our union, but others that are here. Many of you have worked for environmental justice for a lifetime. But we have to be realistic. It's not just about the next election. We've got to bring a democracy to this country that fits the 21st century. A democracy where when we vote for change, like we did in 2008, we get change. Not where we vote for change and then are told, well, now get ready for the next election because we're sorry we can't get that agenda considered. And so, as we are here these days, and we will soon hear a panel to talk about how we work together for environmental justice, for decent jobs, for good jobs, for green jobs. Our challenge is to think about when we go back to our states, and I know that the CWAers that are here from Virginia and Georgia and Florida and Texas, and maybe I left out another one, but are very committed, just as we have done with the Sierra Club, to do joint education. And some of you were at a workshop on that, and I think there's another one tomorrow afternoon. But to do joint education together about what kind of membership in the movement can we build together. Much deeper than just, you know, on the surface, we support this, you support that. Think of that notion as more of a tossed salad where, you know, you still have a tomato, you still have a carrot. We're going to need to create more of a smoothie if we want to stick with food. Anybody hungry? Where at least part of our lives are blended together. That we're building a movement for democracy and economic justice for years to come, that's much deeper than the next election, that's much deeper than any piece of legislation, because we realize that meaningful fight against climate change is beyond reach, at least on the federal level, and much of the state work is preempted, although great work can be done on the state level. That virtually all of the legislation for workers' rights is out of reach. This is what we tell our best activists. We'll have 10,000 of them on the phone tonight. Every month, we hear stories, and Walter Andrews will be on there talking about Occupy Atlanta as one of 6 or 7 of our frontline fighters on that call tonight with 10,000 CWAers. But for a year, we've been saying on those calls to these most active members, we're going to have to go much deeper. We're going to have to build a democracy for the 21st century, much like sisters and brothers are doing in Tunisia or in Egypt. Not what we thought was in store for us in the oldest democracy in the world. And this election, as important as it will be, is not the defining moment it was in 2008, because we now know that democracy is out of reach and that we will have to build a movement much broader than we dreamed of. And whether we're an immigrant or not, we're going to have to act as if we are. And whether we're a person or color or not, we're going to have to act as if we are. And whether we're a union activist or not, we're going to have to act as if we are. And whether we're an environmentalist or not, we must act as if we are. Because if we act together, we can build that movement. We can bring democracy to this country for the 21st century. We can fight for economic justice. We can put the 1% in the place where they belong, as 1%. And the rest of us can stand up and fight back as the 99% that we are. So let's stand up and fight back. 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 Thank you, Blue Green Alliance.